More now on the death of Kim Jong Il and what it could mean for North Korea's relationship with, well, the rest of the world. Christian Whiton was a senior advisor to the U.S. State Department between 2003 and 2009. He joins us live now from Los Angeles. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Whiton. You know, we have this...
Great to be here, Andrew. Thanks.
We have this man in his 20s, stuck at the top of the tree quite suddenly, not much time for grooming. That seems an unstable situation in itself, but you have some experience of the region. What's your headline concern about the short term as it stands now?
My headline concern, actually, that it's going to prompt bad policy from the West, from the U.S. and other capitals, including Tokyo and Seoul. You know, you have this, what appears to be a major change from Kim Jong Il to Kim Jong-un, but it's more of a change in appearances because, as you implied, a 27-year-old, 28-year-old, depending on who you ask, is not going to be the boss of North Korea. He's going to be a ruler in appearance, but in fact, people behind the scenes, either his uncle or a collection of generals, will be running this government. And so there's less of a change. It's essentially the same crew with the same assumptions, the same desire to provoke the outside world to receive foreign assistance in return. And I'm afraid that people will interpret this actually as a new opening that can be exploited.
It calls for delicate diplomacy all round, doesn't it? Because North Korea has this history of reacting very poorly to bad mood music from outside, doesn't it?
Well, it does, although that's a bit of kabuki theater, if you will. North Korea has been essentially acclimated to, or been made to understand that if it acts in provocative ways, that the West will push back a little bit, but then will really try to get back to the negotiating table. And the negotiating table is where North Korea really shines. It has twice fooled two successive U.S. administrations, the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, essentially selling its nuclear weapons program in return for copious amounts of foreign assistance, and then, of course, it never delivered its nuclear program. It's now likely to try that with the Obama administration, and the Obama administration has been quietly trying to restart talks. So I would expect to, frankly, see that again.
Any help, do you think, to the White House from Beijing? Because Kim Jong Il, before he died, in the last couple of years before he died, I think he made up to 4 visits to China to speak to his allies over there. So they must at least have an idea of what he was hoping should happen, or what the North Korean priorities should be. Shouldn't China help the West a bit to get through some of the opaque diplomacy?
They certainly should, and that's right, Andrew, in that that is the one benefactor that North Korea has that it cannot afford to ignore. Unfortunately, Beijing will talk a good game about leaning on North Korea. They certainly had the Bush administration believing that they were leaning on Pyongyang, that they were pushing them to the negotiating table, that they were pushing them to disarm. But the fact of the matter is China is very comfortable with the devil it knows. It knows that North Korea will never turn its nuclear weapons on China, and therefore Beijing gives basically unconditional foreign assistance to North Korea, including basically free fuel, food, other resources, and it's the one place North Korea can turn. So while Beijing will certainly tell us that they are being helpful and want to run negotiations and assist with negotiations, in fact, the history shows it really is unwilling to turn any screws on North Korea because it favors stability above all else. It doesn't want South Korean democracy coming up on its border. It doesn't want U.S. troops closer to its border, and it certainly doesn't want freedom in North Korea, especially with a great number of ethnically Korean Chinese within China's own borders.
You know, the South Korean policy hardened up under the most recent right-wing government, so that hasn't cooled things at all on the peninsula. Is that a concern that there's no real good sounds coming out of any of North, pushing North Korea to continue as is, which, as we're learning in other parts of the world, particularly the Middle East, aren't tenable for the long term? You know, they've got food problems, they've got economic problems, and they're sticking with the sort of nuclear arms military strength is a formula that can't go on forever.
Well, South Korea is a bit schizophrenic in its approach to North Korea. Officially, it favors unification, once a Korean, always a Korean, all Koreans, we're all brothers. But in fact, privately, South Korean officials, including under the new Lee government, which, as you pointed out, is a center-right government, unlike its predecessor, which was more appeasement-oriented towards Pyongyang, but very concerned that they would have to absorb North Korea and that would have a huge financial impact. Unfortunately, I think they've drawn the incorrect conclusions from the unification of Germany and the costs associated with that. I personally don't think absorbing North Korea under South Korea would have to follow the German model or be quite as expensive given just the different speeds and natures of their economies and cultures. But you do have that problem. The Lee government has pushed a little harder on North Korea, but the Obama administration hasn't really matched that, and Japan has basically been absent somewhat from diplomacy under its new government, too, under DPJ rule, which is, as you know, in Japan is rather different from their past. So you've had sort of the absence of a policy toward North Korea, neither pushing or aiding dissidents or broadcasting more information into North Korea or helping with refugees, which you would do if you wanted to promote freedom in North Korea, or a concerted effort at talks, which have, of course, been tried and failed. So it's been basically an absence of a policy from the West, I'd say.
Japan, known to be nervous, always as a neighbour of North Korea. They're the ones, after all, that sit under the missile tests when the North Koreans in the past have decided to send them first. Foreign Minister Koichiro Gemba visiting Hillary Clinton today for talks. What do you think he'll be asking the Secretary of State to do?
Unfortunately, the Japanese have been fairly passive. In the last decade, they were extremely concerned because a number of their citizens were abducted by North Korea. It actually happened before, but it came to light in strong detail in the last decade as a result of defectors leaving North Korea and disclosing the information. And this really captured the imagination and anger, frankly, of the Japanese public and brought their attention to foreign affairs issues in a way it hasn't recently. But Tokyo has really, frankly, deferred to Washington on our approach to North Korea, for better or worse. I don't know they've necessarily been well served by the approaches that the West has made to North Korea, and certainly their interests, their security, and location and resolution of their abductees has never been at the forefront of the policies put forth by Washington or by Seoul. So they may mention something, but unfortunately Japan remains in a long-term stupor where, partly out of post-war reticence, it does not promote its national security interests strongly. There's been some change in the composition of Japan's military. They finally reoriented their domestic conventional forces away from an anti-Soviet posture that they had during the Cold War to one that makes a little more sense for North Korea and China. But we're sort of still in this era of failed policy to North Korea, failed through 2 administrations, going on a 3rd, but it hasn't changed.
Indeed. A complicated issue made a little clearer by Christian Whiton. Thanks very much indeed for joining us from Los Angeles this afternoon. Christian Whiton there. Now, a senior Libyan leader has launched legal action against